Mai Miturich was born in 1925 in Moscow, and both his parents were prominent in the city's avant-garde community of artists and writers. Consequently, his own inclinations for creative activity were enthusiastically encouraged by his mother and father. During the Second World War in 1942, when he was just 17 years old, Miturich volunteered to join the Red Army, and in addition to creating propaganda posters, he fought and was decorated for his bravery. He didn't begin to study art formally until 1947, and for reasons I've been unable to discover, it wasn't until 1957, when he was already 32, that his earliest published work appeared in a book of Chinese fairy tales, for which I could find no visual evidence. The first published examples I did find were his loose watercolour illustrations for the book Poodle by Samuel Marshak in 1960, originally written in the 1930s. 2 years later, Pictures in Puddles, written by Valentina Berestova, was published with a large number of textural mixed media images by Miturich, which, although imaginative, ultimately failed to find a cohesive stylistic approach to settle on. This was followed in 1963 by Grisha by Gennady Snegirev, a writer he would continue to have more successful collaborations with in the decades that followed. And this collection of impressionistic watercolours gave a far clearer idea of the direction his work would ultimately take. In 1965, the book Bullfinch by Sergei Alexiev was published, which seems to have had little to do with that species of bird, and whatever the narrative was, it featured appearances by no less than the long-dead revolutionary Vladimir Lenin. And he used the same technique with even greater authority in the same year's book of poems for children, The Rainbow Book. These brightly coloured watercolour images were some considerable distance from what is generally considered to be representational, and they employed many of the principles found in the work of early and mid-20th century artists, including Henri Matisse and Raoul Dufy. Like them, Miturich used a deliberate gestural application of line and colour, which playfully pushed the pure aesthetics of all his images to the forefront. Manifestly, Miturich had now hit his stride, and 1965 also saw the publication of Daniel Kalm's children's book Merry Siskins, which, in case you're as ignorant as I was, is apparently a little yellow bird. It was a slender, stapled paperback publication, but despite its less than lavish production, it was still highly entertaining and full of joy for little children. In 1966, he worked on yet another book by Samuel Marshak, the intriguingly titled Intelligent Things, which again I struggle to find a narrative thread for, but I'm quite happy to take each image at face value for the sheer visual pleasure to be had in his artful combination of line and limited colour palette. He first visited Japan in 1966 as part of a Soviet delegation of painters, and it wasn't coincidental that a year later he illustrated a collection of Japanese poetry titled Bird Red Bird, with a series of illustrations which revealed his growing fascination for the art of the Far East. The illustration of wildlife was another subject close to his heart, and in 1967 he illustrated an educational book about penguins written by Gennady Snegirev. And he created more for another book by the same author about the lives of reindeer, and both managed the same blend of imagination and accuracy to create images of far greater visual personality than usually found in such overtly educational work. 1968 was another prolific year for Miturich, and among other illustrators he made a meaningful contribution to Barmalay, a collection of absurdist poems for children by Kornei Chukovsky. And the loosely rendered, brightly coloured and highly imaginative images he created were manifestly the result of him successfully channeling his inner Matisse. In the same year, Sunny by Nora Arganuva, a charming story about a young dolphin, was also published. The book featured some particularly expressive scenes of life above and below the waves, some of which were vignetted against page white and others which were full single or double page images. In 1969, Miturich created yet more wildlife illustrations for the book The Commander Islands, with panoramic scenes of animal life on this group of volcanic islands in the far east of Russia. This was a completely unsentimental collection of colourful page illustrations, which really succeeded in capturing the rocky and largely unforgiving environment and the lives of the island's inhabitants very plausibly. The following year's The Chatterbox Fly by Corny Chukovsky could not have been more different, and Miturich's approach to the book was suitably playful and absurdist, with many highly entertaining images filled with assorted anthropomorphic insect characters set against page white. It's asserted by some sources that this book contained veiled unflattering references to the former party leader Joseph Stalin, but I doubt very much that the young readers would have been aware of it. And in the same year, Stories for Kids, another book written by Gennady Snegirev, featured considerably more scenic work and showed just how successfully Miturich was able to harness the principles of abstract art and still manage to create images which felt entirely authentic. In 1971, Miturich published an edition of J.M. Barrie's play for children, Peter Pan, but although its creativity could not be questioned, I'm not completely convinced that such a subtle and complex narrative could successfully be captured by Miturich's deliberately naive style. The following year's Tales of Grandfather Corny, written by Corny Chukovsky, was manifestly more suited to his gestural technique, and the large volume of double and single page images he produced, many of which had the relevant verse embedded in the layout, constituted one of the finest, most representative examples of the potency and sheer visual delight inherent in his image-making skills. And significantly for his career in 1974, the Rainbow Book was first published in English, which was instrumental in introducing his work to a much wider audience outside the Soviet Union. In 1975, a new illustrated edition of Krylov's Fables, originally written in 1803 by Ivan Krylov, was published. And unusually, this was more what could be considered a decorated rather than illustrated book, with the actual stories being executed calligraphically and also incorporating elements from each particular tale. 1976 saw the first of two illustrated versions of Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book, in this instance simply titled Mowgli. And unlike the missed opportunity his earlier Peter Pan might have been, this was a completely triumphant evocation of Kipling's more complex narrative style. There were double-page spreads, single-page images and vignetted smaller pictures throughout, making this edition a sublime blend of image and text. Many, of course, were depictions of the jungle panoramic scenes, but these were tempered with more personal human and animal moments. And this was undoubtedly highly placed among the major achievements of Miturich's career. The same year saw the publication of verse by Agnia Barto, titled Under Our Wing. And among the examples I'm showing from this book in particular, I'm fortunate enough to be able to feature some examples taken from the painted originals, which reveal more clearly his blend of transparent watercolour with application of opaque white laid on top. 1977 was another year of abundant publication by Miturich, with two more sizable projects. His illustrated edition of Lewis Carroll's Alice books yielded yet more fascinating quasi-abstracted watercolours, but as with the earlier Peter Pan, it was at best an odd fit with the sophisticated nature of the narrative. But the same year's collaboration with Gennady Snegirev, The Wonderful Boat, contained many truly mesmerising watercolour illustrations, most of which were essentially scenic images of immense charm and visual attraction. Each gave the impression of complete spontaneity, and like all his work, far from what might be considered conventionally representational, yet highly atmospheric and descriptive. Forest Homes, a book about the natural habitat of various woodland creatures by Vitaly Bianchi, was published in 1979. And like quite a few other books featuring illustrations by Miturich, it was also published in other languages, which continued to enhance his reputation on an international scale. And in counterpoint to the more scenic images of The Wonderful Boat, this collection focused much more closely on the creatures themselves. 1981's Poems for Children featured a collection of yet more expressive, gesturally painted watercolours, which, although not oriental in subject, clearly showed how over the years he had absorbed the influence of Japanese painting and composition. Miturich was also active as a painter and enjoyed some success in that capacity too, but it was his illustration for which he continued to be most admired. In 1983 he illustrated Homer's Odyssey, for which he produced a collection of brush and ink monochrome character portraits and more scenic evocations of this enduring classical adventure. All the colour pages were created quite panoramically, and the essentially human nature of this epic classic didn't really come across with the force and empathy other editions had conveyed. But in the same year the Folk Tales of Japan, also known as Crane's Feathers, was published. And this book in particular was a demonstration of just how profound his appreciation and absorption of Japanese art was. By this time Miturich had visited the East on several occasions and even lived in Japan for a couple of years. Consequently he was by this point totally immersed in the country's culture and had become very popular there. Miturich charmed Japanese readers with the obvious homage to their cultural heritage and the sensitivity and visual empathy clearly shown in the beauty of the images he created. Almost 100,000 copies of the book were sold in Japan alone. And unsurprisingly it sold very well in other territories too. In 1986 he published his illustrated edition of The Scarlet Flower by Sergei Aksakov, originally a Russian folk tale with resonances of the Beauty and the Beast, for which Miturich produced a collection of delightfully decorative illustrations using a particularly light touch, which were every bit as compelling as the best of his work. In 1989 he created a series of compelling, aesthetically considered, semi-abstracted limited edition screen prints, inspired by the writing of author Vitaly Bianchi, all of which were wildlife themed, and they constituted a triumphant translation of his illustration methods into particularly striking art for its own sake. And as if to prove that unlike others who straddled both camps, there really was no essential difference between his art and his illustration, in the same year he published a visually memorable edition of the Rudyard Kipling story The Cat That Walked By Himself, with a series of equally fascinating and visually satisfying watercolours, which were also among his finest creations. The colours used in this book were bright and jewel-like, and once more demonstrated the apparent ease with which he could blend the more abstract visual values with perfectly eloquent visual narration. The children's picture book Cockerel by Raisa Kudasheva followed in 1991, and seems to have been his last illustrated project, at least for quite a few years to come. The evidence suggests that Miturich was increasingly turning to fine art, and it's known that he spent quite some time working with Japanese calligrapher Ryoseki Morimoto on a collaboration I've been completely unable to find any evidence for. But in the early years of the new millennium he returned to India and created quite a large number of even more vibrantly coloured images than his earlier visualisation for a new edition of the Jungle Book, still apparently known as Mowgli. It was published in 2005, and the quality of the new images made it much more than a mere revamp of what he had already created decades earlier. As with many of his other successes, he used changes of viewpoint, complexity of landscape, and a mix of scenic and more character-driven images to hold the reader's attention and reward them with every turn of the page. And it seemed it was a more than fitting epitaph for the man and his relentless creativity, because Miturich died in 2008 at the age of 83. Among those who share my fascination with illustration, there are undoubtedly many who believe that the more conventionally realistic an illustration is, the better. I take the entirely opposite view, and if I was to use an example to make a case for more imaginative, expressive outcomes as the real challenge in illustration, I would put forward Mai Miturich as a champion of this approach. And with that thought, I'll leave you to bask in the wonders of Mai Miturich's absorbing, individualistic and non-realistic images.